They thought they knew her. The quiet girl who sat alone at lunch, whose clothes never quite fit right, who stumbled over words when called upon in class. Sarah Chun had been their target for so long that cruelty had become routine. Tonight's reunion was supposed to be their final victory. One last chance to remind her of her place at the bottom of their carefully constructed social hierarchy. But as the ballroom doors opened and a figure in military dress blues stepped through, something shifted in the air. The woman who entered wasn't the broken teenager they remembered. She moved with the confidence of someone who had commanded thousands, whose decisions had shaped nations. The 4 stars on her shoulder gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, each one representing a journey from the very bottom to the pinnacle of power. Sarah Chun had returned not as the victim they expected, but as General Chun, one of the youngest 4-star generals in military history. And tonight, without saying a single word about revenge, she was about to show them what true strength looked like. This is the story of how the girl they tried to destroy became the woman who would save them all. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to the Pentagon by a courier who had no idea of the storm he was carrying. General Sarah Chun was reviewing intelligence reports when her aide knocked and entered with the cream-colored invitation. The paper felt expensive between her fingers, the kind of quality that screamed old money and careful planning. Westfield High School class of 2003, 20-year reunion, was embossed in elegant gold lettering. Below it, in smaller text, was the date, location, and a note that made Sarah's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Come celebrate with your old friends. We can't wait to see what everyone has become. Sarah set the invitation aside and returned to her reports, but her mind wasn't on national security anymore. It was traveling back 20 years to a different version of herself, a skinny girl with thick glasses and secondhand clothes who had learned to navigate hallways like a combat zone. Her aide, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, noticed her distraction. "Everything all right, General?" Sarah looked up from papers she hadn't actually been reading. "Tell me, Morrison, do you believe in second chances?" "Mom, nothing. Cancel my afternoon meetings. I need to make some calls." The first call was to her mother, who still lived in the same small house where Sarah had grown up. The phone rang 3 times before Helen Chen's familiar voice answered. "Sarah, is everything okay? You never call during work hours." "I'm Fina. Mom, I just got an interesting piece of mail today." Sarah turned the invitation over in her hands. "My high school reunion is next month." The silence on the other end was telling. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice carefully neutral. "Are you planning to go?" "I'm considering it." "Sweetheart, you don't owe those people anything. You've built such a beautiful life. Why look backward?" Sarah understood her mother's concern. Helen Chun had watched her daughter come home from school with torn clothes and bruised spirit too many times to count. She had sat through parent-teacher conferences where educators had insisted that Sarah just needed to try harder to fit in while ignoring the systematic cruelty she faced daily. "I'm not the same person I was then, Mom. I know that. But are they?" It was a fair question. Sarah ended the call promising to think it over, but she had already made her decision. She was going to that reunion, not for them, but for the girl she used to be. The memories came flooding back as she sat in her Pentagon office, surrounded by symbols of her success. 20 years ago, she had been Sarah Chun, daughter of immigrants who worked double shifts to afford their modest lifestyle in an affluent suburb. Her father drove a delivery truck while studying English at night. Her mother cleaned houses and took in sewing to make ends meet. They had moved to Westfield because the schools were supposed to be the best, full of opportunity for their brilliant daughter. What they hadn't anticipated was how quickly children could weaponize difference. Sarah remembered her first day at Westfield High with painful clarity. She had worn her best outfit, a sweater her mother had spent weeks saving for, paired with carefully maintained pants from the discount store. She had been excited, nervous, hopeful. The building was beautiful, all brick and ivy, with resources her previous school could never have dreamed of. She had walked into her first period English class and taken a seat near the middle, not wanting to appear too eager by sitting in front, but not wanting to hide in the back either. That's when she first encountered Madison Brooks, and her circle. Madison had everything Sarah's family couldn't afford: designer clothes that looked effortlessly casual, a car for her 16th birthday, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. She was beautiful in a way that seemed to make everything easy, with perfectly straightened blonde hair and a smile that could charm teachers and devastate rivals. "Oh, how cute," Madison had said, loud enough for the surrounding students to hear. "She's wearing the same sweater my mom donates to charity." The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow. Sarah had looked down at her sweater, the one her mother had been so proud to buy, and felt it transform from a symbol of love to a mark of shame. That was just the beginning. Over the following weeks and months, the harassment escalated. Her locker was vandalized with cruel notes. Her lunch was accidentally knocked out of her hands. She was excluded from group projects, leaving her to work alone while teachers assumed she was being antisocial by choice. The worst part wasn't the obvious cruelty, though. It was the subtle stuff, the way conversations stopped when she approached, the way invitations were discussed just loudly enough for her to hear, but not quite loudly enough to be included, the way her attempts at friendship were met with polite dismissal that left her feeling like she was imagining the rejection. Sarah had tried everything to fit in. She had saved money from her part-time job at the library to buy clothes that would help her blend in, only to have them mocked for being knockoffs. She had volunteered for every school activity, hoping to find somewhere she belonged, only to find herself marginalized in each new environment. The breaking point came during senior year. Sarah had been accepted to West Point, an achievement that should have filled her with pride. She was going to serve her country and get an education that would change her life forever. When the acceptance letter arrived, she had been so excited that she made the mistake of sharing the news at school. Military school, Madison had sneered in the cafeteria, making sure her voice carried. "I guess that makes sense. You'll finally be around people as weird as you are. At least you'll learn how to march in formation," added Jessica, Madison's constant companion. "Maybe we'll help with that awkward walk of hers." The table erupted in laughter, and Sarah felt something inside her break. Not her spirit, that had been damaged but never destroyed. What broke was her last hope that these people might ever see her as anything other than a target. She had stood up from her solitary lunch table, gathered her things, and walked away. But not before making herself a promise. Someday, she would return to this place as someone they couldn't touch, couldn't diminish, couldn't ignore. 20 years later, sitting in her Pentagon office with 4 stars on her shoulders, Sarah realized that someday had arrived. The second call she made was to her assistant, asking him to RSVP to the reunion. Yes, she would be attending. No, she wouldn't need a +1. Yes, she understood the dress code was cocktail attire. What the reunion committee didn't understand was that for General Sarah Chun, cocktail attire meant dress blues. And for a 4-star general, dress blues meant walking into any room as the highest-ranking person there. The third call was to her security detail. A general attending a civilian function required certain precautions, though Sarah suspected that wouldn't be the most surprising thing about her attendance. As she made her arrangements, Sarah thought about the girl she had been and the woman she had become. The path from there to here hadn't been easy. Military Academy had its own challenges, its own hierarchies, its own forms of exclusion. But it had also taught her something invaluable. That respect was earned through competence, courage, and character, not through accidents of birth or wealth. She had excelled at West Point, graduating near the top of her class. Her first assignment had been in logistics, where her analytical mind and attention to detail quickly caught the attention of her superiors. She had volunteered for every difficult assignment, every deployment, every opportunity to prove herself. While her high school classmates were fraternity parties and spring breaks, Sarah was learning to lead soldiers, to make life and death decisions, to bear responsibility for outcomes that mattered beyond social approval. Her rise through the ranks had been steady, but not easy. She had faced discrimination as a woman, as an Asian American, as someone who didn't come from a military family. Each obstacle had made her stronger, more determined, more focused on excellence. She had commanded at every level, from platoon to division. She had served in combat zones where leadership meant keeping people alive, where mistakes had consequences measured in lives lost or saved. She had advised generals and politicians, shaped strategy and policy, earned the respect of peers who had started with every advantage she lacked. And through it all, she had carried with her the memory of that cafeteria, of feeling small and powerless and alone. Not as a wound, but as a reminder of what real strength looked like. Now, as she prepared to return to the place where her journey had begun, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: nervousness. Not about facing her former tormentors. She had faced far more dangerous enemies than suburban bullies. But about confronting the girl she used to be, about honoring the pain that had shaped her without being defined by it. The reunion was still 3 weeks away, but Sarah found herself thinking about it constantly. She wondered what her former classmates had become, whether success had softened their edges or simply given them more sophisticated ways to look down on others. She wondered if Madison still had that perfect smile, if Jessica still followed in her wake, if the boys who had joined in harassment had grown into men who might feel shame for their teenage cruelty. Most of all, she wondered if returning would bring her the closure she hadn't realized she was seeking, or if some wounds were better left undisturbed. The invitation sat on her desk for 3 weeks, a reminder of roads not taken and bridges burned long ago. Every time she saw it, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at the treatment she had endured, pride in how far she had come, and something else, something that might have been anticipation. Because while Sarah Chun had learned many things in her 20 years of military service, perhaps the most important was this: sometimes the only way to truly move forward was to return to where you started and prove to yourself that you had indeed traveled as far as you thought. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the fit of her dress blue uniform. The fabric was crisp, the creases sharp enough to cut paper, and every ribbon and decoration positioned with military precision. 4 silver stars gleamed on each shoulder, catching the light like beacons. She had worn this uniform to state dinners, international conferences, and ceremonies honoring fallen heroes. Tonight, she would wear it to face ghosts from her past. Her reflection showed a woman transformed. Gone were the thick glasses, replaced by contacts and later by corrective surgery. Her posture was ramrod straight, her expression confident and controlled. The awkward teenager who had hunched her shoulders to avoid attention had been replaced by someone who commanded it naturally. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her driver. "Car ready when you are, General." She took one last look in the mirror, straightened an already perfect collar, and headed downstairs. The drive to the hotel would take 45 minutes. 45 minutes to prepare herself for a confrontation 20 years in the making. Meanwhile, across town, the reunion committee was putting finishing touches on the ballroom at the Westfield Grand Hotel. Madison Brooks Hartwell was directing the placement of centerpieces with the same intensity she had once applied to orchestrating high school social dynamics. Madison had aged well, helped by excellent genes, expensive skincare, and a lifestyle funded by her husband's successful law practice. She wore a designer cocktail dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her signature blonde hair was styled in perfectly tousled waves that looked effortless but required an hour in a salon chair. The name tags need to be alphabetical. Madison instructed the hotel staff member who was arranging them. And make sure the premium bar is stocked. Some of these people actually made something of themselves. Jessica Winters Cole stood nearby, nodding agreement while checking items off a clipboard. She had remained Madison's loyal lieutenant even 2 decades later, though law school had given her more sophisticated ways to package her opinions. "Did you see who RSVP'd?" Jessica asked, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Sarah Chun." Madison's hand paused over a centerpiece. "Sarah Chun? Are you sure?" "Positive. Though she's listed as General Sarah Chun on the guest list. I figure it was a mistake. Maybe she married someone military." Madison laughed, the sound brittle around the edges. "Sarah Chun. A general's wife? I suppose stranger things have happened. Remember how she used to follow that ROTC kid around like a lost puppy? Maybe she finally found someone to take care of her, Jessica said. Though I can't imagine what kind of man would be interested in someone so awkward. Neither woman considered the possibility that Sarah might have earned the title herself. In their world, women who achieved military rank were curiosities, not commanders. Success for women looked like advantageous marriages, charity board positions, and children attending prestigious schools. Should we put her at table 12? Jessica asked, consulting her seating chart. Table 12 was in the back corner, traditionally reserved for classmates who hadn't achieved much or whose presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. Perfect, Madison agreed. Next to the teacher's table. She always did prefer their company to ours anyway. What Madison didn't know was that Sarah had specifically requested no special treatment when the hotel's events coordinator had offered to seat her at the head table upon learning of her rank. Sarah wanted to observe first to see how these people had or hadn't changed before revealing the full extent of her transformation. The hotel's assistant manager, a former Marine named Rodriguez, had been the one to handle Sarah's security requirements. When he saw her military record, his entire demeanor had shifted to one of profound respect. "General, it would be an honor to ensure your evening goes smoothly," he had said during their planning call. "Is there anything specific you need?" "Just treat me like any other guest," Sarah had replied. "At least initially. Ma'am, with respect, you're not just any other guest. You're one of the most decorated generals of your generation." Sarah had smiled at that. Her decorations told the story of her career: Bronze Stars for valor in combat, the Distinguished Service Medal for exceptional leadership, campaign ribbons from conflicts around the globe, and commendations for humanitarian missions that had saved thousands of lives. Each ribbon represented not just personal achievement, but moments when she had stood between chaos and order, when her decisions had mattered beyond personal advancement. They were earned in places where high school social rankings meant nothing, where leadership was measured by results, not popularity. Now, as Sarah's car pulled into the hotel's circular drive, she saw groups of her former classmates gathering outside. She recognized some faces despite the passage of time. The football players who had once seemed like gods now fighting middle-age spread. The cheerleaders whose carefully maintained appearance spoke of desperate battles against time. The academic overachievers who wore their professional success like armor. They looked successful, most of them. Well-dressed, confident, surrounded by the comfortable prosperity that came from good schools and family connections. They had gotten exactly what they had expected from life, which was everything they had been taught they deserved. Sarah's driver, Staff Sergeant Williams, held her door open. As she stepped out, several conversations near the entrance faltered and stopped. The sight of a woman in full military dress blues, decorated with ribbons and stars that even civilians could recognize as significant, was unexpected at a suburban high school reunion. "Is that?" someone whispered. "It can't be," came the response. Sarah walked toward the entrance with a measured pace that had carried her across parade grounds and through war zones. Her bearing was unmistakably military, spine straight, shoulders back, eyes forward. Every step conveyed confidence and authority. The first person to recognize her was Mr. Henderson, her old chemistry teacher. He had been one of the few faculty members who had tried to protect her from the worst of the harassment, though his efforts had been limited by his own position in the school's hierarchy. "Sarah," his voice carried a mixture of disbelief and pride. "Sarah Chun." She turned toward him with a genuine smile. "Mr. Henderson, it's good to see you. General Chun, I should say. My God, Sarah, look at you." His eyes took in her uniform, the stars, the ribbons that spoke of a career beyond his imagination. "I always knew you'd do something extraordinary, but this—" "You were one of the teachers who made it possible," Sarah said simply. "You believed in me when not many people did." Their conversation was overheard by several nearby classmates, who began to whisper urgently among themselves. The news spread through the crowd like wildfire. Sarah Chin wasn't just attending the reunion. She was attending as a 4-star general. Madison, inside directing last-minute preparations, was oblivious to the commotion building in the entrance area. She was focused on ensuring everything was perfect, that the evening would unfold exactly as she had planned, a celebration of their collective success and a reminder of the social order that had defined their high school years. The photographer should focus on the head table, Madison instructed. Make sure to get good shots of the successful people. This is going in the alumni newsletter, so we won't put our best foot forward. It never occurred to her that the most successful person in their graduating class was currently being greeted by faculty members in the hotel lobby, or that her carefully planned evening was about to be completely disrupted by the arrival of someone she had spent 4 years trying to make invisible. Sarah moved through the lobby greeting teachers and the few classmates who had always treated her with basic decency. Each conversation was warm but brief. She was gathering intelligence, assessing the lay of the land before making her full entrance into the ballroom. She learned that Brad Morrison had become a successful real estate developer, that Amy Sullivan was now a pediatric surgeon, that Kevin Park had founded a tech startup that had made him wealthy beyond his teenage dreams. The updates were shared with the nervous energy of people unsure how to interact with someone whose achievements dwarf their own. "I can't believe you're a general," said Tim Walsh, who had been student body president and was now a state legislator. "I mean, I always knew you were smart, but military leadership? That's incredible." Sarah could see the recalculation happening behind his eyes, the way people reassessed past interactions when power dynamics shifted. Tim had never been cruel to her, but he had never defended her either. Now he was faced with the realization that the girl he had overlooked was someone who could command armies. "Leadership isn't about popularity," Sarah said quietly. "It's about competence, integrity, and the willingness to serve something larger than yourself." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Tim shifted uncomfortably. He was remembering, perhaps, the times he had stayed silent when he could have spoken up, the times he had chosen social safety over moral courage. From the ballroom came the sound of a microphone being tested, followed by Madison's voice welcoming everyone to their 20-year reunion. Sarah glanced toward the entrance to the main event, then back at the small group that had gathered around her. "Shall we go in?" she asked. What happened next would depend on many factors. How much these people had changed, whether success had taught them wisdom or simply given them better disguises for their cruelty, whether they could see past their own assumptions to recognize what real achievement looked like. But for Sarah, the outcome mattered less than the journey. She had returned not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to herself, that she had indeed traveled far enough from the scared teenager she had been to face her past without fear. The ballroom doors stood before them, and beyond them waited 20 years of unfinished business. Sarah straightened her shoulders, checked that her ribbons were properly aligned, and prepared to enter not as the victim they remembered, but as the victor she had become. The girl they tried to break was about to show them what unbreakable looked like. The ballroom doors opened, and conversations gradually ceased like dominoes falling in reverse. Sarah entered with a small group of teachers and classmates who had gathered around her, but within moments she stood alone as people unconsciously stepped back, creating space around her that felt both respectful and awed. The Westfield Grand Hotel had spared no expense for the reunion. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables dressed in the school colors of navy and gold. A professional photographer moved discreetly through the crowd, capturing smiles and embraces. A full bar occupied one corner while a DJ played carefully selected hits from their graduation year. But all of that faded into background as every eye in the room focused on the woman in dress blues standing just inside the entrance. Madison's welcoming speech faltered mid-sentence as she caught sight of Sarah. The microphone in her hand seemed to grow heavy as her carefully prepared words evaporated. Around the room, recognition dawned on face after face, accompanied by expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something that might have been fear. Sarah took in the scene with the trained eye of someone accustomed to assessing tactical situations. She noted the location of exits, the distribution of people throughout the space, and, most importantly, the psychology of the crowd. These were people comfortable in their environment, secure in their assumptions about hierarchy and belonging. Her presence was disrupting all of that. Is that really Sarah Chun? The whisper came from somewhere to her left. Look at those stars. Is she really a general? 4 stars. Do you know what that means? My cousin's in the army. He says 4-star generals are like they command entire regions. Hundreds of thousands of people. The whispers spread like ripples in a pond, carrying with them the dawning realization that the girl they had dismissed and derided had achieved something extraordinary. Not just success, but the kind of success that redefined how they understood power and achievement. Sarah made her way toward the registration table, where her name tag waited. The volunteer behind the table, a woman she didn't recognize but who clearly recognized her, fumbled with the materials. General Chun, the volunteer stammered. We weren't expecting. Your name tag just says Sarah Chun, but we can make a new one. That's fine, Sarah said with a slight smile. Sarah Chun is who I was when I knew these people. It's the name that belongs here tonight. She pinned the simple name tag to her uniform, a deliberate contrast to the ribbons and decorations that spoke of her achievements. The gesture was both humble and powerful, an acknowledgement of her origins and a reminder of how far she had traveled. Madison finally found her voice and continued her welcome, but her eyes kept drifting to Sarah. The planned festivities suddenly felt trivial in the presence of someone whose achievements dwarfed anything their small social circle had produced. Let's all take a moment to reconnect with old friends, Madison announced, her voice carrying a slight tremor. Dinner will be served in 30 minutes. The crowd began to circulate, but the normal reunion dynamics were completely disrupted. Instead of the usual clustering around the most popular kids from high school, people were gravitating towards Sarah, drawn by curiosity and the undeniable magnetism of real power. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had been the class valedictorian and was now a respected cardiologist, was among the first to approach. Sarah, I owe you an apology, she said without preamble. I should have spoken up for you in high school. I was too worried about my own position to do the right thing. Sarah studied Patricia's face, seeing genuine remorse there. We were all trying to survive adolescence the best way we knew how, she replied diplomatically. What matters is who we became. Still, Patricia insisted. I've thought about it over the years, especially when my own daughter started high school. I taught her that silence in the face of cruelty is its own form of participation. I should have learned that lesson 20 years ago. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Brad Morrison, the former football captain who now ran a successful construction business. Brad had been one of Sarah's more vocal tormentors, particularly after she had spurned his crude advances during junior year. Sarah Chun, he said, extending his hand with the aggressive friendliness of a natural politician. Look at you. A general. That's incredible. I always knew you had it in you. Sarah regarded his outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it briefly. Did you, Brad? I don't recall you expressing much confidence in my potential. A flush crept up Brad's neck as several nearby conversations quieted. People were listening, waiting to see how this interaction would unfold. Brad had been the kind of teenager who used his size and popularity to intimidate anyone he perceived as weak. Now he was faced with someone whose power was real, not dependent on social approval or physical dominance. Well, you know how kids are, Brad said with a forced laugh. We were all just messing around. I hope you didn't take any of that seriously. I took it seriously enough to remember it, Sarah said quietly. Her tone was conversational, but there was steel underneath. Character revealed in adversity, as they say. Before Brad could respond, Sarah excused herself and moved toward the bar. The crowd parted before her, conversations stopping and starting in her wake. She ordered a club soda with lime, her standard drink when in uniform, and found herself immediately surrounded by curious classmates. Questions came from all directions. Where had she served? How did someone become a 4-star general? What was it like commanding troops? Did she know the president personally? Sarah answered with the ease of someone accustomed to public speaking. sharing appropriately general information about her career while deflecting anything classified or too personal. She spoke about leadership lessons learned in combat zones, about the honor of serving with America's finest young people, about the responsibility that came with rank. What she didn't mention were the specific moments that had shaped her. The night she had held a dying soldier's hand in Afghanistan. The classified briefing where she had argued against a strategy that would have cost thousands of lives. The phone call informing her that her unit had successfully evacuated civilians from a natural disaster zone. Those experiences belonged to a different world than this ballroom, but they had forged her into someone who couldn't be diminished by high school memories, no matter how painful. Across the room, Madison watched the crowd surrounding Sarah with growing frustration. This was supposed to be her evening, her chance to showcase the success of their class and, by extension, her own position as Queen Bee. Instead, everyone was clustering around the girl she had spent 4 years trying to make invisible. "She's certainly making a spectacle of herself," Madison said to Jessica, who stood beside her with a champagne flute clutched in white-knuckled fingers. "It's just a uniform," Jessica replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm sure she's exaggerating her importance. You know how Sarah always was desperate for attention." But even as she spoke, Jessica was remembering the conversation she had overheard, the way people spoke about 4-star generals with an eye usually reserved for celebrities or presidents. This wasn't exaggeration. This was the real thing. Madison's husband, Richard Hartwell, joined them with drinks and a bemused expression. "Who's the general everyone's talking about?" "She's quite impressive." "That's Sarah Chun," Madison said through gritted teeth. "We went to high school together." Richard raised an eyebrows. "The Sarah Chun? The one who testified before Congress about military readiness? The one who commanded the Pacific Theater? That's Sarah Chun." Madison's champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. "You know who she is?" "Honey, everyone in Washington knows who she is. She's been featured on the cover of Time magazine. Foreign Policy called her one of the most influential military leaders of our generation." Richard looked across the room with new appreciation. "You went to high school with her? That's incredible." The color drained from Madison's face as she realized what Richard was telling her. While she had been dismissing Sarah as a girl playing dress-up, Sarah had actually achieved a level of success and recognition that dwarfed anything Madison had ever imagined possible. Meanwhile, Sarah was being approached by Kevin Park, who had been one of the few Asian American students in their class and had faced his own share of discrimination, though nothing as systematic as what Sarah had endured. "Sarah, I have to ask," Kevin said quietly, positioning himself so their conversation couldn't be easily overheard. "Why did you come tonight? After everything they put you through, why give them the satisfaction?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I didn't come for their satisfaction," she said finally. "I came because I needed to prove something to myself, which was that they never actually had the power to define me. They thought they did, and for a while I believed it too. But real power isn't about making others feel small. It's about lifting others up, protecting those who can't protect themselves, serving something greater than your own ego." Kevin nodded slowly. "You've certainly proved that." "Have I?" Sarah asked. The night is still young. As if summoned by her words, Madison appeared at Sarah's elbow, her smile bright and brittle as crystal. "Sarah, I simply had to come over and congratulate you." "A general? Who would have thought?" Madison's laugh had an edge to it, the sound of someone trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping away from her. Sarah turned to face her former tormentor, and, for a moment, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Here were the two poles of their high school experience, the Queen Bee and the outcast, now transformed by 20 years of very different choices. "Madison," Sarah said evenly, "you look well. Marriage agrees with you." "Oh, you know how it is. Richard keeps me busy with charity work and social obligations. It's nothing as exciting as your career, of course." Madison's tone suggested that exciting was not necessarily a compliment. "Service takes many forms," Sarah replied diplomatically. "I'm sure your community work is valuable." But Madison wasn't ready to let the conversation remain polite. Perhaps emboldened by champagne, or perhaps driven by a need to reassert dominance that had defined her identity for decades. She pressed forward. I have to admit, Sarah, when I heard you were coming tonight, I was surprised. I wasn't sure you'd want to revisit, well, the old days. High school can be so difficult for some people. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, conversations faltered as people sensed the tension building between the two women. This was the confrontation everyone had been waiting for, even if they hadn't realized it. Sarah met Madison's challenge with the calm that came from facing down far more dangerous adversaries than a suburban socialite. The ballroom had grown quiet around them, conversations dying as people sensed the electricity in the air between the two women. High school was indeed difficult, Sarah agreed, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush. I learned some valuable lessons about character during those years, about who people really are when they think there are no consequences for their actions. Madison's smile wavered slightly, but she pressed on. Well, you certainly seem to have overcome any challenges. Though I have to say, the military seems like such an unusual choice for someone who is always so. She paused, searching for the right word. Gentle, gentle, Sarah repeated thoughtfully. I suppose from your perspective, kindness might have looked like weakness. That's an easy mistake to make when you've never been tested. The barb hit its mark. Madison's face flushed, and several people around them shifted uncomfortably. Jessica stepped closer to her friend, offering silent support, but even she seemed uncertain in the face of Sarah's quiet authority. Test it. Madison's voice rose slightly. I think we all faced our share of tests. Some of us just had better support systems. It was a reference to Sarah's family's economic status, delivered with the casual cruelty that Madison had perfected in high school. But Sarah was no longer the vulnerable teenager who could be wounded by such comments. You're right, Sarah said, her tone remaining steady. I was fortunate to have parents who taught me that worth isn't determined by wealth or popularity. They taught me that real strength comes from service, from protecting others, from standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. She paused, letting her eyes sweep the crowd that had gathered around them. Those lessons served me well when I was responsible for the lives of soldiers in combat zones, when I had to make decisions that affected thousands of people, when I testified before Congress about military readiness and national security. The specificity of her achievements cut through the ballroom's polite atmosphere like a blade. These weren't vague boasts or exaggerations. They were the resume of someone who had operated at the highest levels of government and military leadership. Madison scrambled to regain her footing. Well, of course, we all admire public service. Richard and I contribute to several veterans organizations. We understand the importance of supporting our troops. Do you? Sarah asked quietly. Do you understand what it means to hold the life of a 19-year-old soldier in your hands? To know that your decisions determine whether families get their children back home safely. The question hung in the air, and Madison had no answer for it. Her contributions to charity, however well-intentioned, seemed suddenly shallow in comparison to the weight of actual responsibility for life and death. Dr. Williams stepped forward, perhaps sensing that the confrontation was heading toward territory that might leave permanent damage. Sarah, could you tell us about your service? I think we'd all be interested to hear about your experiences. Sarah nodded, grateful for the diplomatic intervention. She began to speak about her career, but not in the way Madison might have expected. She didn't boast about her rank or decorations. Instead, she spoke about the people she had served with and the lessons they had taught her. She talked about Sergeant Rodriguez, who had saved her life during her first deployment by teaching her to listen to what her soldiers weren't saying. She spoke of Colonel Washington, her first commanding officer, who had shown her that true leadership meant taking responsibility for failures and sharing credit for successes. She described the young lieutenant who had been killed in action while following her orders, and how that loss had taught her that rank was not a privilege, but a burden, a responsibility to be worthy of the trust placed in you. As she spoke, the ballroom transformed. These weren't war stories or tales of glory. They were testimonies to character forged in circumstances none of her classmates could imagine. The audience found themselves drawn into a world where courage was measured not by social standing, but by willingness to sacrifice for others. Leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room, Sarah continued. It's about bringing out the best in everyone around you. It's about creating an environment where people can succeed, where their strengths are utilized and their weaknesses are supported. Her eyes found Madison's as she continued. The best leaders I've known were those who lifted others up, not those who tore them down. They understood that true power comes from empowerment, not dominance. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Around the ballroom, people began to remember their own high school experiences, their own moments of courage or cowardice, their own choices to stand up or stay silent. Brad Morrison, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, suddenly stepped forward. His face was flushed, whether from alcohol or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. "Okay, look," he said loudly. "I think we need to address the elephant in the room here. We all know there was some tension in high school, but we were kids, right? Kids do stupid things. It doesn't define who we are now." Sarah turned her attention to Brad, and for a moment, the two of them might have been back in the high school cafeteria, except now the power dynamic was completely reversed. "You're right, Brad," Sarah said calmly. "We were kids, but our actions had consequences then, just as they do now. The question isn't whether we were young. It's whether we learned anything from our choices." What's that supposed to mean? It means that some people use their youth as an excuse to be cruel, and some people use their pain as motivation to be better. Some people peaked in high school, and some people use high school as a starting point for growth. The distinction was clear to everyone in the room. Sarah wasn't just talking about academic or professional achievement. She was talking about moral development, about the kind of person you chose to become when faced with the opportunity to hurt others. Madison tried one last time to regain control of the situation. "I think you're being a little dramatic, Sarah. High school social dynamics are just part of growing up. Everyone has to find their place." "You're right again," Sarah agreed. "Everyone does have to find their place. I found mine serving my country, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, working to make the world a safer place." "What did you find yours to be?" The question was asked without malice, but it cut deeper than any insult could have. Madison had built her adult identity around the same foundations as her teenage popularity: wealth, social connections, and the ability to exclude others from her circle. Faced with someone whose achievements dwarfed her own, whose contributions to society were measurable and meaningful, she had no answer. The silence stretched until Richard Hartwell, Madison's husband, stepped forward with the diplomatic skills that had made him a successful attorney. "General Chun, I wonder if you might share some thoughts on leadership with us. In your experience, what makes the difference between good leaders and great ones?" Sarah recognized the intervention for what it was and accepted it gracefully. She began to speak about leadership philosophy, about the principles that had guided her career. But her words carried deeper meanings for everyone who had been present during her high school years. She spoke about the importance of moral courage, of standing up for what's right even when it's unpopular. She talked about the obligation that comes with power, the responsibility to use authority to protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. She discussed the difference between leading through fear and leading through inspiration, between commanding respect and demanding submission. Every principle she outlined was implicit criticism of the way Madison and her circle had operated in high school, a roadmap for what leadership could look like when practiced by someone with genuine character. As Sarah spoke, something shifted in the room. The reunion had become something none of them had expected, a masterclass in leadership, delivered by someone who had actually lived the principles she espoused. People began to see their high school experiences through a different lens, to understand that the hierarchies they had accepted as natural were actually choices, and that different choices might have led to different outcomes for everyone. The photographer, who had been discreetly documenting the evening, captured image after image of Sarah speaking to the crowd. These photos would eventually make their way into the alumni newsletter, but They would tell a very different story than the one Madison had planned. Instead of showcasing the traditional markers of success, wealth, status, attractive spouses, they would show something rarer and more valuable. A person who had transformed pain into purpose, who had used their achievements to elevate others rather than diminish them. As Sarah concluded her impromptu leadership seminar, the crowd began to disperse slowly, people clearly processing what they had heard. Some approached Sarah with questions about military service, about leadership challenges, about finding purpose in their own careers. Others simply wanted to apologize, to acknowledge their own failings as teenagers, to express admiration for what she had achieved despite the obstacles they had placed in her path. Madison stood alone near the bar, her carefully planned evening in ruins. The reunion that was supposed to celebrate their collective success had instead highlighted the difference between achievement and accomplishment, between popularity and respect, between being remembered and being admired. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself in quiet conversations with classmates who approached her one by one. Some came to apologize, others to express admiration, and a few simply to understand how someone had transformed pain into such extraordinary purpose. Amy Sullivan, the pediatric surgeon, sat beside Sarah at a quiet table near the windows. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Amy began, "about character being revealed in adversity. I realized I never really faced much adversity in high school. I was popular enough, smart enough, protected enough. I wonder sometimes if that was actually a disadvantage." Sarah considered the comment carefully. Adversity isn't something anyone should wish for, but how we respond to it does define us. "You've saved children's lives, Amy. That's its own kind of character test. But I wonder if I could have been kinder back then, if I had understood what real courage looked like." "Understanding it now is what matters," Sarah replied. "We can't change the past, but we can learn from it." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of someone Sarah hadn't expected to see tonight. Marcus Thompson had been one of her few friends in high school, a quiet kid who played chess and read science fiction novels. He had been bullied too, though not as systematically as Sarah. "I almost didn't come tonight," Marcus said, settling into a chair across from them. "But when I heard you were going to be here, I had to see it for myself." Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time all evening. "Marcus, it's so good to see you. What have you been up to?" "Teaching," he said simply. "High school mathematics. Been at it for 15 years now." "That's wonderful work. I tell my students about you sometimes," Marcus continued. "About how the girl everyone overlooked became one of the most powerful military leaders in the country. It gives the kids who are struggling something to hold on to." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was worth more than all the apologies and admiration combined. "You're doing important work, Marcus. Those kids are lucky to have someone who understands what it's like to feel invisible." "I learned from the best," he said. "You never let them break you, Sarah. Even when it seemed like the whole world was against you, you never gave up on becoming something better." Across the ballroom, Madison watched this interaction with growing isolation. Throughout the evening, she had witnessed classmate after classmate approach Sarah with respect and admiration. Her own circle had gradually diminished as people gravitated toward genuine substance over superficial charm. Jessica stood beside her, both women nursing half-empty wine glasses and wearing expressions of barely concealed defeat. "I don't understand it," Madison said quietly. "We were the popular ones. We were successful. We did everything right." "Maybe that's the problem," Jessica replied, surprising herself at the honesty. "Maybe we peaked in high school and never pushed ourselves to become anything more." Madison looked at her oldest friend with shock. Jessica had never criticized their approach before, had never questioned the assumptions that had guided their lives since adolescence. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Look around, Madison. Look at how people are responding to her. It's not because of her uniform or her rank. It's because she represents something we never learned to value. Actual character, real strength, the kind of leadership that comes from service rather than entitlement." The words hung between them. 20 years of unexamined assumptions suddenly laid bare. Madison wanted to argue, to defend their choices, to maintain the narrative that had sustained her since graduation. But the evidence was all around her. Sarah had commanded respect without demanding it, had demonstrated power without wielding it as a weapon, had achieved greatness without needing to diminish others. Everything Madison thought she understood about success and social dynamics had been turned upside down. Meanwhile, Sarah was saying goodbye to Mr. Henderson and several other teachers who had made the evening special by their presence. "You've made us all proud, Sarah," said Mrs. Patterson, who had been her English teacher. "But more than that, you've shown these young people what's possible when someone refuses to be defined by others' limitations." "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself," Sarah replied. Good teachers change lives in ways they never fully know. As the formal part of the reunion wound down, people began to leave in small groups. Many stopped to shake Sarah's hand or exchange contact information. Some spoke about their own children, expressing hope that they would show the same resilience and character that Sarah had demonstrated. Dr. Williams approached one final time, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sarah, I know I already apologized, but I want you to know that watching you tonight has changed something in me. My daughter starts high school next year, and I'm going to make sure she understands what real strength looks like. Just teach her to be kind," Sarah said simply. "Everything else follows from that." As the crowd thinned, Sarah found herself alone with Marcus and a few other genuine friends from their graduating class. The conversation turned to their shared experiences, the moments of connection they had found despite the hostile environment that had surrounded them. "Do you remember the day you stood up to Brad Morrison?" Marcus asked. "Junior year, when he was picking on that freshman kid with the stutter?" Sarah nodded. She remembered it clearly. Brad had been mimicking the boy's speech impediment, drawing laughter from his friends and tears from his victim. Sarah had intervened, drawing Brad's fury onto herself, but stopping the harassment. "I was too scared to help you," Marcus admitted. "I've regretted it ever since." "We all did what we could with what we had then," Sarah said. "What matters is that we learned from those moments." "You were already a leader then," Amy observed. "You just didn't have the platform to show it." Sarah considered this. Maybe. Or maybe leadership is something that develops through practice, through making the choice to serve others, even when it costs you something. Brad Morrison appeared at their table, his earlier bravado replaced by something that might have been shame. He stood for a moment, clearly struggling with what to say. "Sarah," he finally began, his voice rough, "I owe you an apology. Not the kind I tried to give earlier, but a real one. I was cruel to you, and it was wrong. I've thought about it over the years, especially after I had kids of my own. I'm sorry." Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Thank you, Brad. That means something. I've been wondering all night," he continued, "why you came back here. After everything we put you through, why give us the chance to hurt you again?" "Because," Sarah said slowly, "I needed to see if I had truly forgiven you. And I needed to understand something about the nature of strength, which was that real strength isn't about being invulnerable. It's about being able to face your past without being controlled by it. It's about choosing grace over revenge, even when revenge would be easier." Brad nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You could have destroyed us tonight. With your position, your achievements, you could have made us all look like fools. What would that have accomplished? The girl you tormented 20 years ago is gone. She was replaced by someone who understands that true power comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down." As Brad walked away, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of completion. The wounds of the past weren't erased, but they had been transformed into something useful, something that had driven her to become a person capable of grace under pressure. Madison appeared one final time as Sarah was preparing to leave. Gone was the brittle confidence she had displayed earlier. In its place was something raw and uncertain. "Sarah," Madison said quietly, "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but can you forgive me? Not for tonight, but for everything." Sarah looked at her former tormentor, seeing not the powerful queen bee of memory, but a middle-aged woman grappling with the realization that her entire value system might have been flawed. "Madison, I forgave you years ago. Not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying that anger would have made me less than I needed to be. Ow! Madison asked, tears beginning to fall. How did you do it? How did you become so strong? I learned that strength isn't about never falling down, Sarah replied gently. It's about getting up every time you do fall and choosing to be better than you were before. I learned that from you, actually. From me. Your cruelty taught me the importance of kindness. Your exclusion taught me the value of inclusion. Your use of power to hurt others taught me to use whatever power I gained to help others. In a strange way, you helped shape the leader I became. Madison's tears flowed freely now, the careful makeup of the evening running in dark streams down her cheeks. I wasted it all, didn't I? All those years when I could have been learning to be better, to be more. I wasted them. It's not too late, Sarah said simply. Tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. What you do with it is up to you. As Sarah walked toward the exit, she reflected on the evening's events. She had come seeking closure and had found something more valuable. Confirmation that she had indeed traveled far enough from her past to face it without fear. The scared teenager who had once sat alone in the cafeteria was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that true victory wasn't about proving others wrong, but about becoming so completely yourself that their opinions couldn't touch you. Her driver was waiting outside, and as she settled into the back seat for the ride back to Washington, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. The ghosts of her past had been laid to rest, not through confrontation or revenge, but through the simple demonstration that growth was possible, that character could be built, that strength could be cultivated. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Marcus. Thank you for showing us all what leadership looks like. My students are going to hear about tonight for years to come. More messages followed throughout the drive home, from classmates expressing gratitude, from former teachers sharing pride, from people whose lives have been touched by witnessing authentic character in action. But the message that meant the most came from an unexpected source. It was from Madison. You showed me what I could become. Thank you for that gift. I'm going to try to be worthy of it. As Sarah's car pulled in her driveway, she realized that the reunion had accomplished something she hadn't expected. It hadn't just closed a chapter from her past. It had opened new possibilities for her former classmates' futures. The girl they had tried to break had returned not as a conqueror, but as a teacher. Not to prove their weakness, but to demonstrate what strength could look like when properly cultivated and correctly applied. In choosing grace over revenge, Sarah had given them all something more valuable than humiliation or vindication. She had given them a roadmap for growth, an example of what was possible when someone decided to transform their pain into purpose. Years later, when members of Westfield High School's class of 2003 told their children about their 20-year reunion, they wouldn't talk about the decorations or the music or the food. They would talk about the night they learned what real leadership looked like, demonstrated by the girl who had been underestimated by everyone, including herself. They would tell stories of transformation and redemption, of character forged in adversity, of the difference between success and significance. And at the center of all those stories would be Sarah Chun, the four-star general who had returned not to settle scores, but to settle the question of what she had become. The answer was clear to everyone who witnessed it. She had become exactly what her country, her service, and her character demanded. She had become a leader worthy of the star she wore, the responsibilities she carried, and the example she set. Most importantly, she had become living proof that the girl they had tried to make invisible had been destined to become impossible to ignore.